My daughter left me on that mountain trail and drove away with my truck. I heard the engine turn over. I heard the tires on gravel. And then I heard nothing but wind through the pines and my own breathing, which was already harder than it should have been at that altitude. She didn't look back. I know because I watched until the red taillights disappeared around the bend. I stood there with my bad knee and one water bottle, and the thin jacket I'd grabbed last minute from the hook by the door. And I thought, this is how it ends. Not with a heart attack in my recliner. Not in some hospital bed with tubes in my arms. Out here on a mountain in eastern Oregon where nobody would find me until spring, if they ever did at all. That was October 14th. 3 years ago now. I'm 67 years old, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell this story ever since. I guess I'll start the way it started for me. With my daughter calling on a Sunday morning and saying she missed me. That she wanted us to spend real time together before winter came. That she'd always wanted to hike up to Steens Mountain with me, the way we used to go camping when she was little. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. But when your child reaches out after 18 months of distance and says she misses you, you don't cross-examine her. You just say yes. You say, of course, I'd love that. You say, let me check my boots are still good. Her name is Natalie. She's 38 years old. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's way of smiling with only one side of her mouth, and for a long time that was enough to make me forgive her most things. I moved to Bend, Oregon 7 years ago when my wife Helen died. We'd spent 31 years in the same house in Columbus, Ohio, raised our 2 kids there, buried Helen's parents there. But after she was gone, the house felt like a museum to a life that had ended, and my son, Natalie's older brother Marcus, had settled out west and kept saying, "Dad, just come." So I did. I sold the Columbus house and bought a smaller place in Bend, about 4 acres, backed up to national forest land. It wasn't cheap, even then. Now it's worth something considerable. I should say that plainly because it matters to the story. The property matters. The life insurance policy matters. The fact that I'd updated my will 8 months before that Sunday phone call, that matters most of all. I am not a wealthy man by most measures. I worked 34 years as a machinist for an industrial equipment company in Columbus. I have a pension, a modest one, and Social Security, and the equity in my Bend property which has grown more than I ever expected. When I updated my will, everything went equally to Natalie and Marcus. The property, the retirement accounts, the life insurance, split down the middle. What I didn't know was that Natalie had started talking to a real estate attorney 6 weeks before she called me that Sunday. I found that out later, much later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The hike was her idea from the start. She drove up from Nedford, where she'd been living since her second divorce. Showed up Friday evening with a new pair of hiking boots still in the box and a backpack she said she'd borrowed from a friend. She seemed nervous, but I chalked that up to the strangeness between us. We hadn't spent real time together in over a year. There had been arguments about money. There had been a loan I'd given her that had never been mentioned again. I was trying not to hold on to those things. We had dinner that first night, and it was almost normal. She asked about my neighbor, Phil, who checks on me sometimes. She asked if I still went to the Thursday morning coffee group at the church. She asked twice whether I had my cell phone updated, whether the battery held a charge. I thought she was being considerate. I told her the phone was fine. Saturday morning we got up early. She'd planned the route. She showed me on a printed map. The trailhead on the south side of Steens Mountain, a loop that would take us to a ridge overlook and back down by early afternoon. Nothing extreme. I've done harder trails. My knee gives me trouble on descents, but I have a good pair of poles and I know my pace. We drove out in my truck because her car had been making a noise. That was what she said. The first 2 hours were genuinely good. I want to say that clearly, because it matters too. We talked about her kids. She has 2 from her first marriage, teenagers now, and I don't see them nearly enough. She talked about maybe going back to school. She seemed lighter than she had in years, and I felt something ease open in my chest that I hadn't realized had been closed. I thought, this is it. This is her coming back around. People do that. They drift and then they find their way back. Around mile 4, she said. Her knee was bothering her. She asked if we could stop at the truck for the knee brace she'd left in the back seat. I said of course. We'd looped back close enough that the trailhead was only about a quarter mile down the service road. When we got to the truck, I leaned my poles against the hood and bent down to stretch my leg. I heard her open the driver's door. I thought she was reaching into the back. She started the engine. I stood up. I said, "Natalie, what are you doing?" She looked at me through the windshield. Not with anger. That's the part that stays with me. Not anger, not guilt, just something flat and determined, like she had already moved past this moment in her mind and was somewhere else entirely. She said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." Then she backed out and drove away. I stood on that gravel road for what felt like a long time before my legs decided what to do. My poles was still leaning against where the hood had been. My pack was on my back. My phone, I checked immediately, showed 1 bar, then no bars, then 1 bar again. The nearest town was French Glen, 22 miles. My knee was already aching from the morning's hike. I want to tell you I stayed calm. The truth is, I sat down on a rock and I said some things out loud to nobody that I'm not proud of. Then I stood up and started walking because there was nothing else to do. The temperature drops fast up there in October. By the time I'd covered 4 miles on the service road, the wind had turned mean, and the light was starting to go amber in that way. That means you have maybe 90 minutes before dark. My water bottle was 2/3 empty. I had a granola bar in my jacket pocket, and half a sleeve of crackers in my pack, and a rain poncho that wouldn't do much against real cold. I kept walking. My knee was screaming below the kneecap the way it does when I've pushed it past what it wants to give. I used 1 pole to take the weight off, and I talked to myself a little to stay in the walking rhythm. I thought about Helen. I thought about the morning we brought Natalie home from the hospital, how she'd screamed the whole drive and then gone perfectly quiet the moment Helen held her against her shoulder, like she'd just needed to know she wasn't alone. I thought about what I might have done differently. At around mile 6, a ranch truck came up the road behind me. An older man, maybe 75, with a cattle dog in the passenger seat and a woman's reading glasses on the dash that he clearly wasn't using. He slowed and rolled the window down and looked at me the way people do when they're trying to figure out if you're trouble or if you need help. I told him my situation as plainly as I could, that my daughter had driven off with my truck and left me out here and I needed to get to French Glen or get to a phone that worked. He was quiet for a moment. The dog watched me. He said, "Get in." His name was Lawrence. He'd ranched that land for 40 years. He didn't ask a lot of questions on the drive, which I was grateful for. But at one point he said, "Your daughter?" And I said, "Yes, my daughter." And he shook his head slowly and said nothing else. Sometimes there isn't anything to say. He drove me to French Glen. I used the landline at the French Glen Hotel. It's a historic place, small. They were closing up for the season. And I called Marcus. Marcus answered on the second ring. I told him what happened. There was a silence on the line that I won't forget. That particular silence when someone is trying to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. He said, "Stay there. I'm coming." It was a 4-hour drive from where Marcus lives outside a bend. He made it in 3.5. While I waited, I sat in the small lobby of that hotel, which smelled like wood polish and old quilts, and I thought through everything from the last several months with new eyes. The way Natalie had asked last Christmas whether I'd ever thought about selling the property and moving somewhere smaller. The way she'd brought up carefully that property values in Bend had peaked and might drop. The way she'd asked me, twice, who my attorney was. I'd answered all of those questions honestly. I'm a straightforward person. I was raised to be. Marcus arrived at 10:30 at night. He hugged me in the parking lot and I could feel how tense he was, holding himself together. He's like his mother that way. He put me in his car and handed me coffee from a thermos and drove. And on the way back he told me what he'd found out in the hours since my call. He'd called Natalie immediately after hanging up with me. She hadn't answered. He'd called her neighbor in Medford, a woman named Diane who looked after Natalie's cat when she traveled. Diane had seen Natalie loading boxes into a U-Haul the previous week. She'd thought Natalie was just clearing out a storage unit. Marcus had also, in those 3.5 hours, called my attorney, Tom Gallagher, whose cell number he'd had since I'd set up my will. Tom told him that someone had called his office 2 weeks prior claiming to be my daughter, asking general questions about estate administration in the state of Oregon and what circumstances could trigger an early transfer of assets. Tom hadn't given out any specific information. He'd noted it as an odd call and hadn't connected it yet. Natalie's plan, as we eventually pieced it together through the investigation and later through what she told her own attorney, had been this. If I didn't come back from that mountain, she was already positioned to move quickly on the estate. She'd done enough research to know that when someone dies in a remote area, when the body isn't immediately recovered, there is a process. A long process. But she'd apparently convinced herself it could be expedited with the right pressure. She'd also called my insurance company twice in the past month with questions about beneficiary procedures. She had not counted on Lawrence and his cattle dog. She had not counted on a lot of things. When we got back to Bend, Marcus took me to the emergency room because my knee had swollen to a size that alarmed us both, and a doctor there confirmed I had aggravated an old meniscus tear significantly. I had an ice pack on my knee and a paper cup of bad coffee and my son sitting next to me at 2 a.m. And I remember thinking that if not for Lawrence, this waiting room would not be where I was tonight. The police report was filed the next morning. What Natalie had done was not simple to prosecute. Abandonment, criminal negligence, a range of things that depend on intent and circumstance, and what a prosecutor thinks a jury will believe. She had not pushed me off anything. She had driven away. The question of whether she intended my death or simply intended my absence while she worked her angles on the estate was, it turned out, a significant legal distinction. I will tell you what the consequences were because I know that's what you want to know. And because I think you deserve a straight answer and not some vague conclusion. Natalie was charged with criminal mistreatment in the 2nd degree under Oregon law. It is a Class A misdemeanor. She pleaded no contest and received 18 months of probation and was required to complete 200 hours of community service. She also received a civil judgment against her for my medical expenses and for other damages that my attorney pursued with what I would describe as considerable enthusiasm. More importantly to me, at least, I updated my will the following January. Natalie is no longer a beneficiary, not of the property, not of the accounts, not of the insurance policy. My attorney made sure it was done carefully and documented thoroughly, anticipating any future challenge. She tried to call me 4 times in the first month. I did not answer. She sent a letter in February, 3 pages, handwritten. I read it once and put it in a drawer. I have not read it again. I don't say any of this with satisfaction. I want to be honest about that. There is no version of this story where something clean and good came out of it. No version where I gained something I didn't lose. A different thing to have. She is my daughter. She was born in a hospital in Columbus on a rainy March morning, and I was in that room, and I cut the cord, and I have held the fact of her in my chest every day of my life since then, whether I wanted to or not. But I am also still alive, and I do not take that lightly. This past summer, Marcus and I drove out to Steens Mountain together. We parked at the south trailhead and hiked up to the ridge overlook, the same route on Natalie's printed map. My knee held. We packed better than I did in October, 2 full water bottles each. Real snacks. Layers. We sat up on that ridge in the late afternoon and looked out over the Alvord Desert below and the long sage flats stretching east toward Nevada, and neither of us said much. At some point, Marcus said, "I'm glad you're here, Dad." Just that. I said, "Me too, son. Me too." The light was doing that thing it does up high in late summer, going gold and then going pink, turning the rocks into something that looked almost warm. I watched it, and I thought about Lawrence, who I'd sent a letter and a case of decent Oregon wine, and who had written back a short note in blocky handwriting saying it was no trouble, and that his dog appreciated the beef jerky I'd included. I thought about Helen, and what she would have said about all of it, and I know well enough by now not to try to put her words in her mouth. But I think she would have wanted me to go back. I think she would have said, "Don't let fear take that mountain from you." So I went back. My name is not important. I'm a 67-year-old retired machinist from Oregon with a bad knee and 4 acres and a son who answers on the second ring. That's enough. That's more than enough. If there is one thing I would say to anyone watching this, and I mean this not as a conclusion with a bow on it, because life doesn't work that way, but as something I have genuinely come to understand from the far side of a very cold October night. Pay attention to the questions people ask you before they need the answers. The questions tell you everything. I didn't, and it almost cost me everything. But I'm still here, and some mornings, most mornings now, honestly, that feels like enough. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. More time than I expected to have, honestly, given how that October was supposed to end. What I keep coming back to is not the cold, not the knee, not the 22 miles of empty road. What I keep coming back to is the look on my daughter's face through that windshield, flat, already somewhere else. And I think about how long a person has to practice something before it looks that easy. How many small decisions made quietly over months or years lead a person to a moment like that. It doesn't happen overnight. That's the thing nobody tells you. The betrayal that looks sudden almost never is. I made mistakes. I'll own them plainly. I saw the questions Natalie was asking, and I chose to hear them as concern. I wanted them to be concern. There's a version of intelligence that isn't about how much you know. It's about being willing to see what's actually in front of you, even when seeing it costs you something. I didn't have that kind of courage back then. I have the other kind. The kind that looks away and calls itself kindness. Natalie made choices too. A long chain of them. Every decision she made. Calling the real estate attorney. Researching estate procedures. Asking about my insurance. Planning that drive up to Steen's Mountain. Each one was a link she added herself. Nobody forced her hand. And those choices had weight. They had consequence. Not because the universe punishes people in some tidy, cosmic way, but because actions shape circumstances, and circumstances eventually close in. She thought she was building a future. She was building a case against herself. Lawrence didn't owe me anything. He was a man driving his own land in his own truck with his dog, and he slowed down because slowing down for someone on an empty road is what decent people do. That's it. There's no grand meaning to pull from it. Just a man who hadn't yet decided that other people's problems were none of his business. I think about him more than he probably thinks about me. Marcus answered on the second ring. He drove 4 hours in 3.5. He sat next to me in an emergency room at 2 in the morning without complaining once. That's the other side of this story. The side that's easy to overlook when you're focused on what went wrong. Some people run toward you. Some people run away. And over a long enough life, you start to understand that those are choices too, just as deliberate, just as revealing. The will is updated. The property will go to Marcus, to my grandchildren, to people who have spent their time being present rather than positioning. That felt, at first, like a punishment I was administering. Now it feels like something simpler. It feels like accuracy, like getting the record straight. I went back to that mountain because I needed to know I could. My knee held. The light was beautiful. Marcus sat next to me on a rock at the ridge and didn't say much, which is exactly what I needed. I'm still here. Some mornings, that's the whole story.